Welcome to Women Read Scripture, Come Follow Me New Testament. I'm Marianna Richardson.
And I'm a woman of many names, Annette Marie Lantos Tillemann-Dick.
And I'm Christine Thackeray.
Today we're going to be talking about the historical period of time, 400 years between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the interesting thing about this time period is that we don't really talk about it very much. And a matter of fact, in the Come Follow Me curriculum, they really do not discuss this period of time that we're going to be talking about. So I am really excited about this discussion. The first thing we're going to be talking about is the Apocrypha. And there are all kinds of Apocrypha writings that happened during this period of time. And many of us might not have read it or know the background in terms of this historical writings. But I want you to know some of these stories are fantastic. And so we're going to have Annette start us off with her love of the Apocrypha.
Well, I am thrilled to have been given this opportunity, and I want to begin with a quote. It is, "Therefore, whoso readeth it, let him understand, for the Spirit manifesteth truth, and whoso is enlighteneth by the Spirit shall obtain benefit therefrom. And whoso receiveth not by the Spirit cannot be benefited." These words of inspiration were recorded by Joseph Smith after he sought guidance from the Lord when he was translating this ancient sacred book, the Bible, and came to the Apocrypha. During the approximately 400 years, as Marianna mentioned, between the book of Malachi and the book of Matthew in the New Testament, life and the recording of it did not stop in Israel. The collection of 14 or 15 books is known and that we've collected is called the Apocrypha. They were the product of this period. This collection was preserved, respected, but disputed when it came to their standing as equally authoritative to other canonical scripture of the Old Testament.
So, Annette, I have a question for
Yes.
you. Why was it disputed? Why did people feel that way about the Apocrypha? Because I think it's, an interesting thought. We don't, as members of the church, really read the Apocrypha. And what is your thoughts and feelings on that?
Well, I love that question, Marianna, and there are a couple of it's an involved answer, but let me start by saying that in about 70, 80 AD, the Sanhedrin, which were the Jewish High Council, decided the Apocrypha would not be part of the Jewish canon. They were still important books, but not part of the Jewish canon. Now, if you read them, there's some kind of obvious reasons, because one of the stories we'll look at today, and there are many like this, there are crazy mixed up historical facts in it. And anybody who knew the history knew this is wrong. So as Jewish scholars read it, it was very clear that these books could not by any stretch of the imagination necessarily be considered straight up history or even or straight up prophecy. There isn't too much prophecy in the Apocrypha. In fact, that's one of the things that distinguishes it. There's no "thus saith the Lord" kind of protestations in the Apocrypha.
But there's some pretty outlandish stories that are in the Apocrypha, which are kind of fun reading, actually.
And inspiring, wildly inspiring and profound. In the Septuagint, which was the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Apocrypha was included. So it wasn't included in the Hebrew Old Testament when it was sort of put together as a canon, but it was in the Septuagint. And for that reason, Catholics embraced it. Now, let me just say this. When in, I think it was 400, the Pope of that time asked Jerome to translate the Greek Septuagint into Latin.
Right.
And that became the Latin Vulgate version.
Mm-hmm.
Jerome did it. He translated the Apocrypha, but he used also the Hebrew scriptures, and he knew that these were not considered completely equal to the Hebrew scriptures. So he put a special preface that said different, and not quite equal to. But over the years, with all the copiers, many of them left out his prefaces, and eventually the Apocrypha was completely integrated into the Catholic
Now, the
Bible.
Septuagint, isn't that also something that the Savior would have read? Would the Savior have read and known about some of these Apocrypha writings as well?
Oh, yes, he would have probably. If yes, he would have known because he knew.
Right. He would have
But
been reading
he would have
them.
studied them
Yes.
along with everything else.
Exactly.
And they're wonderful. So that is a very good question. Now, where was I? In fact, these books, this collection, disputed. Apocrypha means, and I love this, it means secret and hidden. I think the idea of hidden, secret, sacred books is quite familiar to members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I agree.
Because our beloved Book of Mormon is a collection of sacred historical records that were literally hidden in a stone box by an ancient prophet who returned to earth to reveal those books and writings to the young prophet Joseph Smith and told him, keep these secret and hidden until you are told to share them. So that whole idea is something we are not unfamiliar with. But this Apocrypha is not a Book of Mormon hidden in the Hill Cumorah. Rather, it is a collection that has been squirreled away in some editions of the Bible, eliminated in many others. And one of the reasons it was eliminated was not necessarily because it was not quite co-equal, but because it was cheaper not to have to print this extra 15 books.
Oh, I love it.
You know, don't you love it?
It's
Doesn't
all
that make
about
sense?
money.
That
right?
makes a
It's all
lot
about
of
money.
sense.
To Americans, that makes lots of sense. But the Apocrypha is always included in the Catholic Bible, in fact, it's integrated into it. It's not a separate set of books in the Catholic Bible. So in the 91st section of the D&C, Joseph Smith shares this inspired perspective. Verily, thus saith the Lord unto you concerning the Apocrypha. There are many things contained therein that are true. And it is mostly translated correctly. There are many things contained that are not true, which is totally true. And those are the interpolations by the hand of men. I love that Joseph Smith nails it. That is probably why the Jewish leaders did not include it, because it was very obvious to them that some of the things were not true.
Right.
So Joseph Smith recommended that we need to read it with the Spirit. And if we read it with the Spirit, it will be of great value to us. So the period between when the Apocrypha was written, this what they call intertestamental period, it is called the intertestamental period in the Protestant vernacular.
Sure.
The Catholics call it the deuterocanonical period.
Boy,
which
that's a
means
hard word.
Later than the canon, after the canon.
Sure.
Deutero means after, so it was put in after the canon.
Nice.
It's not meant to be less than there, but just after.
Right.
But so this period, which included about 300 years before Jesus' birth and about the 100 years afterwards, which include what they call the time of John the Baptist.
Sure.
These stories were not necessarily well documented, but they occur more or less. I mean, some of them they say occur way before, but this is when they were recorded. And they jump all over the place in the funniest ways. And rather amusing and improbable ways. We'll get to that. So there are 15 books considered part of the Apocrypha, and I'm going to name them because we don't usually hear them. There's the first book of Esdras, the second book of Esdras, which is related to Ezra, the prophet,
Right.
and the high priest Ezra. Tobit, Judith, the additions to the book of Esther, Ecclesiasticus, or the wisdom of Jesus, the son of Sirach, Baruch, the letter of Jeremiah, the prayer of Azariah, and the song of the three young men. You know, remember Azariah, Mishael, and
Right. The wonderful Daniel story.
yeah, the
Daniel,
Shadrach,
Meshach, and
Abednego.
Abednego.
Yeah,
They're the ones we
we're
like.
trying. Once you learn it, you try to do those Hebrew names because they're
Oh, yeah.
better.
They're
But we
so
still
fun.
know Shadrach, Meshach, and
Yes.
Abednego. So here's a little more about them in here. Susanna, Bel and the Dragon,
I know, that's
I
my
love-
favorite
the
one.
prayer of Manasseh, the first book of Maccabees, and the second book of Maccabees.
Right.
In some, in some apocryphal collections, the letter of Jeremiah is put together with Baruch, the book of Baruch. It's the last chapter, so that would only be 14. But otherwise, there are 15
Well, and
discrete
I
parts.
love the women. I mean, look at that in terms of the women's names,
The
in terms of the
names.
Apocrypha.
Right.
You know,
Isn't that great?
I mean, Shoshana, of course, means lily in Hebrew. But you know what Judith means? Jewish woman.
oh, okay.
Isn't that funny? So
That
her name
makes
is
me
Judith.
happy.
It means Judith, you're a Jewish
Jewish woman.
Yeah.
That's impressive.
And you'll see
And she is.
quite the archetypal. a real standard. So moving right along. When the Protestant Reformation took place in the 15th and 16th century, Martin Luther, who thought, and this is funny, that Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelations really probably shouldn't be in the New Testament.
Wow.
Oh, I'm so
Isn't
glad.
that
I am so glad that
Why?
that
I
didn't
mean,
happen. I want those.
He-
Those are some of my favorites.
There's been lots of conversation around that, and some said he really felt that they emphasized too much works over grace.
All right,
But
that makes sense.
The people who love Luther and studied him in depth say no, he loved those books, but he felt that they were misused in the Catholic Church of his
that
time.
makes sense.
I thought that did make sense.
That actually.
I'm already at 10 minutes. Not even close. Okay. Well, so we are moving right along. I want to tell you about the Book of Judith. Can I have a few minutes?
I'm excited.
Yes,
Yes,
yes.
please. It's such a great story. It's such a great story.
A great story. So the Book of Judith begins on a rather unconvincing note. We learn that Nebuchadnezzar, that Babylonian bad guy,
Right.
the one who was fond of just, having fits of all sorts and
Oh, yeah.
throwing fits and then throwing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the flaming fire as well.
Well, and he went crazy for a period of time.
Oh, that too. I
Yeah.
mean, he was really crazy.
Eating plants,
but-
and running around naked.
But now,
that kind
many
of stuff.
hundreds of
Right.
years later, he is not the ruler of Babylon, but he's the ruler of Assyria. So that is how we begin. Yeah, no, that didn't happen. That was like the Jews were like, no. But some scholars believe that this wild disregard for historical accuracy in the Apocrypha could have been intentional. It could have been that they wanted you to know these are not historical stories, but they are important stories. So that's an interesting thought too, isn't it? So anyway, old King Nebu is at it again, raging about how the Western countries in his sphere did not send people to support him in his military campaign against King Arxaphod, who nobody knows who King Arxaphod is.
It's
But
a great name, though.
it is a great name, and it looks even better when you spell it because there's X's in it. I love names with
okay.
X's in it. But they didn't come and help him fight. Now, he
Sure.
won the battle, but never won to say no to an opportunity for more blood and gore. He decides that he is going to first they have, after his big victory, they have 125 days of feasting, which remember in Esther, all that feasting. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
back to
Lots
the
of
big
food.
feasting. Yeah.
Great food.
And after the feasting, he's not in a good mood. He's like, we are going to punish those guys. And he calls in his big general, Holofernes, which is also a good bad guy name, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Holofernes. Ooh.
Holofernes.
Like fierce.
I love it.
Fierce. Yeah.
Holofernes. I just love it. Anyway, he calls his chief general, who is second only to himself, and he says this. I'm going to just read it. Thus says the great king, the Lord of the whole earth, when you leave my presence, take with you men confident in their strength to the number of 120,000 foot soldiers and 12,000 cavalry. Go and attack the whole West Country because they disobeyed my orders. So, let's just
All right. Well,
beat them up because
Nebuchadnezzar thing.
get back at them. This is in Judith 2, the second book of Judith, verses 5 and 6. We do not meet Judith in the first 7 chapters of her book. Nebu rants. He promises to rain terror on all those who will not bow to him, and then he sends Holofernes to do his dirty work, which he willingly and eagerly does. He seized the territory of Cilicia and killed everyone who resisted him. Then he went down into the plain of Damascus during the wheat harvest and burned all their fields and destroyed all their flocks and herds and sacked their cities and ravaged their lands and put to death all their young men with the edge of the sword.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
That's a
not-
lot of killing.
Lot of killing.
Yeah.
When the high priest in Jerusalem hears, along with everyone else in the neighborhood, of this ruthless advance of Holofernes, he exhorts the Jewish citizens in the surrounding areas around Jerusalem to fortify their positions and hold Holofernes off at the pass. Literally, there's a pass, and they need to hold him off so he doesn't get to Jerusalem. Obediently, this post-exilic population, because we have to understand, they're writing about Jews who've come back after the Babylonian exile.
Right.
They are now recommitting themselves to real faithfulness at this point. And the high priest says it, they're like, yes, we'll do it. And they prepared to defend themselves against the advances of Holofernes. So the Israelites did as Joachim, the high priest, and the senate of the whole people of Israel in session at Jerusalem. I love that they had a senate in Jerusalem in session. And it's in this old book, where they say it just like ours. They followed these orders that they were given. And every man of Israel cried out to God with great fervor, and they humbled themselves with much fasting. Don't you love that? Judith 5. Holofernes is infuriated to learn that despite his overwhelming and obvious force, these victims are intending to fight back. At this point, something very interesting happens. Can I go on a little more?
Yeah.
An Ammonite leader named Achior comes to him and warns Holofernes. Look, man, these Jews, they're different. This is the deal. If they're obeying their God, you are not going to be able to defeat them. And then he does something so cool. For somebody who loves studying the Old Testament, one thing that we've talked about is the sacred history. That if you read the Old Testament, you'll see over and over again the sacred history is repeated. They go through all the miracles God has performed to bring them to this day. Passover.
Oh, it's like Moses and the
Right.
parting of the Red
And
Sea
everything.
is always
All of
brought
it.
back.
But
Even
there's
in the
so
Book of
many-
Mormon,
and
they do that.
In Hebrews in the New Testament too, there's this reciting of the
Right,
sacred
right.
history.
Love that.
Achior, who is not Jewish, he's an Ammonite, recites the sacred history. He said, they did this, and he goes, when they're disobedient, their God kicks them out. But then they went to Egypt, they were made slaves in Egypt, but somehow God helped them. He dried up the Red Sea, they got to cross it. He goes through it, and he goes through miracle after miracle. Bread coming down from the heavens. But he goes through one miracle after another. And he says, you can't, unless they do something wrong, they will, I love this, I want to read it to you. He says, sorry. But because it's so interesting what he says. This is what it says in the scriptures. He says, unless Israel transgresses, which will make them vulnerable, they will not be vulnerable, and their God shall protect them, and we shall be put to shame before the whole world.
Okay, he's warning him.
love
Isn't that powerful?
But that's a
warning
promise that's still intact today.
Totally.
Yes.
That is
Yes.
so awesome.
The promise is intact. The processes are intact.
Yes.
Prayer, fasting, humility,
So true.
going to the Lord. It's the same story. That's what we do in our daily lives.
So how does Judas come into play?
Soon.
Okay.
Outraged. But first, so Holofernes is so furious at this guy for suggesting that they can't go against this puny little group of people that he has his people bind him up and throw him at the walls of the Jewish city of this mythical city, Bethulia.
Ooh.
Anyway, the Jewish leaders come out, they pick him up, they bring him in and unbind him and say, why are you here? And he said, well, I'm here because this is what I told Holofernes. And he was very angry. And the Jewish leaders, everybody, they're just thrilled that he understands the way
Right.
that God
He understands the
works.
Jews.
Yes.
Right. He
It
understands
is
God.
sweet. And it's
And
really
it's
neat.
nice that someone's nice to him when he does what's
I
right.
know.
It wasn't
That's
fairness,
good.
but at least there was
Yeah.
somebody.
But left out there, meanwhile, Holofernes is again advised, this time by Moabites and the chieftains of the people of Esau. They say to him, remain in your camp and keep all the men of your forces with you. Only let your servants take possession of the spring of water that flows from the foot of the mountain, for this is where all the people of Bethulia get their water, so thirst will destroy them, and they will give up their city.
Yeah.
They are not wrong. So fast forward about a month, and the people in Bethulia are not happy, and they go to their leaders, and they say, the people of Israel cried out to the Lord their God, for their courage failed, and all the people then gathered around the rulers of the city and said, God, judge between you and us, because he's trying to hold out.
Right,
He's trying, you and us. For you have done us a great injury in not making peace with the Assyrians. For it would be better for us to be captured by them. For we will be slaves, but our lives will be spared, and we shall not witness the death of our babes before our eyes, or see our wives and children draw their last breaths. I mean, these are very contemporary stories, aren't they?
Yes,
Yeah.
they are.
It's what choices
So
we make?
so where is Judith?
Coming.
Okay,
coming.
Judith, we want
Right
Judith.
now.
We want Judith.
This was in chapter 7. Chapter 8, enter Judith, a righteous, childless widow. For 3 years, she's been a widow for only 3 years and 4 months. When you're a widow, as a widow, I know that you count every month, a day for
I am
even now.
sure.
That's just one of the things you do. So it was 3 years and 4 months that she was a widow. She is appalled. I mean, appalled at the prospect of God's people giving up and distressed at their lack of faith. She hears about it because the whole town is talking about this. She's in her home. She sends her servant. She has a maid servant who is really her close helper and manages everything for her. She sends her to the leaders of the city and tells them to come to her house. And they come, and though they are impressed with her faith, and she says, let's do something. We can't give up. God may help us, he may not, but he knows what he's doing, and we can't break our covenant with him. And they say, well, we've now promised the people. You're right. We really think you're right. She says, listen to me. I love this. She goes, listen to me. I am about to do a thing which will go down through the generations of our descendants. Stand at the gate tonight, and I will go out with my maid, and within the days after which you have promised to surrender our city to the enemies, the Lord will deliver Israel by my hand. Only do not try to find out what I plan, for I will not tell you until I have finished what I am about to do.
I love her.
Judith, in sackcloth and ashes, goes home and prays and fasts and prostrates herself before the Lord. Behold their pride, she says to him about the Assyrians.
Sure.
Assyrians/Babylon. Behold their pride, and send thy wrath upon their head. Give to me, a widow, the strength to do what I plan. By the deceit of my lips, strike down the slave with the prince, and the prince with his servant. Crush their arrogance by the hand of a woman, which is considered the supreme insult, that a woman
Would do that.
source.
Doesn't it remind you of
Definitely.
Deborah and Jael.
Oh,
Totally.
definitely.
I
know,
You
you
know,
love
and the
Yes.
and the tent
makes me
through his
so happy.
forehead.
I know.
Boom. I know.
And she goes on, and I have to say, so beautiful. There are many scriptures. Jonathan when he battled with just his one helper, that whole force, and came back.
Right.
His father was mad because he hadn't fasted. Remember, but
Sure.
says. But Judith says to the Lord, for thy power depends not on numbers, nor thy might upon men of strength. For thou art God of the lowly, helper of the oppressed, upholder of the weak, protector of the forlorn, savior of those without hope. Hear, oh, hear me, God of my father, God of the inheritance of Israel, Lord of heaven and earth, creator of the waters, king of thy creation. Hear my prayer. Make my deceitful words to be their wound and stripe, for they have planned cruel things against thy covenant. It's about protecting the covenant. And, that's what it is. And against thy consecrated house. It's about protecting the temple. I mean, it's so beautiful. And cause thy whole nation and every tribe to know and understand that though thou art God, the God of all power and might, and that there is none other that protects the people of Israel but thou alone.
And this is so similar to Esther. As we were talking about the whole idea of Esther and her feelings and thoughts as she's saving Israel. And we hear those similar words with Judith.
Well, and I think that idea of women protecting those of the covenant
Oh,
is what we each do in our own homes with our own children, especially with our teenagers. So that is
100%. That's what we do as
It is
moms.
every day.
At it,
I hear you.
Every while that we can figure out. And this is Judith. So Judith begs the Lord to help her deceive the lethal enemy of her people. This is probably the only place in Scripture where we actually see a woman praying for the Lord's help to execute a deception. But she does this. It is not the first example of biblical women deceiving. And I think
we had Tamar, we talked about, and
She's
some of
like
the other,
Rebecca,
and then Rebecca.
Sarah, Rahab. It goes on and on.
You're
There's a
right.
long list.
You're right.
But then she takes off her mourning garb. She bathes and perfumes herself, puts on her most gorgeous clothes. They say the clothes that she wore when her husband was alive. And they are truly beautiful, and her jewelry and her anklets. She combs her hair. And it's very funny. In the King James translation of it, it says she puts a tire on her head. You know, they didn't have tires.
I can just imagine.
That's and then you real. But in the Revised Standard Version, which is the very authoritative one, it says a tiara on her.
Oh,
head.
a tiara.
I thought that that could
Much better, the little crown.
Oh, I love it.
That's
That's
so she puts a tiara on her head, and next she goes off. She prepares to leave with her handmaiden. She puts into a bag pure food that is permissible for her to eat, and her handmaiden. And she goes by evening through the city gate. The elders of the city are stunned. They're really quite starstruck because she looks very different.
Oh, I'm
from
sure
the
she's
way,
gorgeous.
We look
She's
better.
beautiful.
I
know.
At the end of this, I was like, because you really have a desire, especially after pandemic. It's like, this stuff isn't very important. We don't need to get dressed ever. We don't need to. And it's kind of nice, not to worry about it.
I was thinking about those makeup tutorials where the person you see them and then they are made up and it's a totally different person.
And that must have been what happened.
That's
because
Judith.
They were stunned. And they watch her as she goes down the mountain. They open the gate. She goes through the valley. And they keep watching until they can see her no longer. The two women are met by an Assyrian patrol. They take Judith into custody and ask who she is and where she's come from and where she thinks she's going. She explains she is a daughter of the Hebrews and she is on her way to help Holofernes obliterate her faithless people. With her words and her wiles, she wins the hearts of the guards, who choose 100 men to escort her to the tent of Holofernes. Wow. They say, just do what you're going to do. He's going to be into it. He's going to be excited by this. They see her and they're like, he's going to be really excited.
She's about you.
Good,
Right.
exactly. So she meets Holofernes, who is very intrigued, and she explains to him that every night that she is here, that in fact, what the others have told her, because she explains Alkior came in and told them that it's true, that as long as her people are obedient, God will protect them. But they're about to not be obedient. Mm-hmm. And she is going to go out every day and pray, and the Lord will let her know when they have broken their covenants, and then he has to strike. And
so clever, because she takes 90% truth and twists a little piece. That is so clever.
I mean, it's an inspired story.
Sure.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And so he is very mindful and very respectful, even though she's this gorgeous woman, for they give her a special tent, and that's where she's, and every night they know she walks out to pray with her her servant and helper. But on the third night, or it's fourth night, Holofernes is going to have a party for his people, just his servants and slaves, and he wants her to come. And so he sends someone over to bring her to his tent. She prepares herself beautifully. She goes looking like a knockout. And he is delighted when he sees her. He says, I want you to come and drink with me tonight. And she said, absolutely. You know I can only drink my things. So she gets her things. She says, yes, I will. And he then drinks, and it is hilarious because it says that he drank more than he had ever drunk any day
Oh,
since he
my
was born.
goodness.
And that is how it says this in the scripture.
You're wondering if she
getting
egged
ready.
him on,
Well,
you know?
oh, totally.
Of
I mean, it was,
course.
we know in the Book of Mormon of, times when alcohol was used for good purposes.
Definitely.
And this was definitely that. So
very fun.
eventually all the servants and slaves leave the party, but she is left there in the tent with him. He is totally laid out,
Oh, yeah.
completely in
Sloshed.
a stupor, sloshed, totally. At which point she says 2 prayers, she gets his sword, and I thought about this. I don't know if I could do it. I thought, you could do it if your whole people's lives depended on it. I don't know if I could do it, But she gets his sword, and with 2 mighty blows, she severs his head.
Wow.
She throws him off the bed. She pushes him off the bed. She takes the head. Her young maiden is waiting outside, as she told her, with the bag. Put the head in the bag, and as they did every night, they walk out of the camp.
Oh
But they
my
just keep on
goodness.
walking
They keep
this
on
time.
going
And she
with
sets
the
up
head.
walking
with
out of
the
the
head.
camp ahead of time too.
I love telling
love
the story to
it. I love
Christine, who
it.
doesn't know it, because you're like the best. Your kids never paid this much attention, Christine. I love it so much. Anyway, so she gets to the walls of the city. They're thrilled to see her. They didn't know whether she'd be killed, right? She looks fine. She comes in. She tells them, tonight Israel has been delivered by my hand and by the Lord's hand. Of course, she gives the Lord credit, but definitely she had to do it. And takes out the head. Then they do some gory things. They put it up on stage.
Of course,
she
they
said,
had to
now
show off the head.
show off.
Show off the head.
And of course, the troops go into pandemonium, and they run away, and they rout them, and they go, and they of course leave everything behind. I love one
what a
little
great
detail,
story.
that all the fancy things in Holofernes' tent they give to Judith.
Oh.
They give to Judith, and she, though she is beautiful and all the men of the town would love to marry her, she remains a widow for the rest of her life. And I can relate to this, it's just sort of neat because I never heard a story like that where they tell about
it's
it.
a little like a righteous Delilah, with Samson.
Oh, definitely.
It is just, it's like the
Yes.
the
Yeah,
good
you're
girl instead of the evil. It
Yes,
is so
yes.
funny.
Anyway, and she, there's a beautiful set of sort of psalms and celebration at the end. And at the very end it says, and no one ever again spread terror among the people of Israel in the days of Judith, or for a long time after her death.
Well, but that's understandable. I mean, everybody would be like, Judith, you are
Right.
incredible. And everybody would know about Judith.
I
and
mean,
her
this
story.
was a story that would be sounded far and wide. So,
And
what-
about the God of Israel.
Exactly.
That he really
Yes.
does
That he
protect
really
them
does
through this
protect
weak
them.
woman.
Exactly.
That he uses the
this
weak.
vessel.
Right.
So if you think you have a big
Although I shouldn't
army
say
and
women are
everybody
weak.
else,
She was clever and she was gorgeous.
She was a strong woman, definitely a strong
But
woman.
also she made the most of whatever she had.
I know,
You know
I
what I
love
mean?
that. I
Yeah.
love it.
And it was sort of neat. So I had a question, and it was, which we talked about a little bit. How did Judith summon the vision, wit, and strength to save her people in Israel? What was her secret weapon? Was it her wit? Was it her looks? No, what was her secret weapon?
Well, of course, it was her dedication to the Lord and to the covenants that she had made. And I think for me, what a great example of a covenantal woman who, was strong about her covenants and strong about her faith.
That's fascinating that would be your answer, because I was thinking it was her prep work before, where she went to her tent and she prayed and she really made that connection. But the long-term work is like pre that short-term prep.
They go together.
do,
I love
definitely.
that you had two
They go-
such different thoughts that come to your mind. You know?
Yep.
But they are part and parcel of the thing, but you need them. She prayed. She put in those days, sackcloth and ashes and fasted.
And her prayer was long. You went on forever
Exactly.
with
And
her prayer.
specific.
I know.
Very specific. Was
She had a good
brilliant,
prayer.
Beautiful prayer.
So devout practice and devout prayer and living for God and others was, themes to me.
Well, and thank you for that wonderful discussion about the Apocrypha, because I do think that one thing we can look forward to in the New Testament is that understanding of basically those beautiful stories are continued through that 400 years. It's not like the Old Testament happened and then the Jews never wrote another thing until all of a sudden the New Testament happened. There were these beautiful stories that were read and talked about and told. And so I love the fact that you talked about that and that so many women were a part of those stories, which is so wonderful too.
It is.
I know that Christine was going to talk a lot about the Maccabees because it's important for us to understand the history of the Maccabees and what happened during this historical period.
Right. We were going to start with you telling us about a Hanukkah.
A little setup
which has
on Hanukkah.
So much meaning.
So I'm not going to do a big setup on Hanukkah. Just
That's
I
okay.
mean, every year you can sit with your kids and you tell them the whole story, but it happened around this period in 168 BCE, which is before the Common Era. That is
Right.
the way, because Jews, and this is interesting. The Jewish calendar dates from a time that Maimonides, the great Jewish scholar Maimonides, decided that this was the date when the creation occurred, when Adam and Eve were created.
Right.
And it was like 3,600, and I know the right number, but I don't have it.
It's okay.
Anyway, and that is where their calendar starts. So this is, so they can converse with other human beings. They call it the Common Era, what we call AD, Annos Dios, the year of God, and BC is before Christ, we think, but they call it before the Common Era, which is that meridian of time still. So in 168, this ruler, Seleucid ruler, Antiochus
she
the
said
Fourth. How we say it. Antiochus the Fourth came to power in this area of Jerusalem, and up till then, they'd been under Greek domination, but they'd been relatively absentee landlords.
Right.
They let them do their own
Right.
thing.
Right.
Yeah, but when Antiochus the Fourth came in, he was much harsher, and he didn't want people studying the scriptures. He definitely didn't want them worshiping their God.
No.
And to make a point of it, he put Greek gods and big statues
Right. All
in the
over.
temple, and really desecrated the temple, which caused people great sadness, but they were overwhelmed. So, and this is a funny little story. They said that the Jews still wanted to be faithful, but they'd hide their holy books. They'd have tables with tablecloths, and that's why Jews always have tablecloths. They hide their holy books on tablecloths. And when they would study, but when the troops would come to check, when their guards, because it was kind of a police state, they would just be playing, the dreidel, they were
Sure,
playing
sure.
a gambling game. It's a
Right.
gambling game, basically. That they were just these lazy Jews,
Right,
playing this gambling game, and so that's just sort of fun. But at a certain point, it became you either worshipped his god, you ate pig, you did these things, or you didn't. And a certain group, the Maccabees, and their high priest was Mattathias, the father of a clan of brave men. Decided to stand up to him.
Right.
And that is where the Maccabees go up into the hills and decide to fight back. They're hugely overwhelmed, but they have a good position, and there are many wonderful stories about them beating back the elephants and beating back. We don't know if it's all
love
true,
the
but they're
elephant
great
story.
stories. But amazingly, Antiochus IV gets sick of it.
Right.
And he just says, it's not worth it. And he goes home. And they come down out of the hills, and they retake the temple, and they cleanse the temple. And Hanukkah means dedication, which to me is just like we dedicate our temples.
Yes.
Hanukkah
Yes.
is named because of the temple dedication. It was a rededication. We do that with our temples if something happens.
Right.
And they clean it and they dedicate it. It was the tradition, and this story came later. It's not in the Maccabee story, that when the temple was functioning, there was a lamp of oil that would burn continually. And when they did this cleansing, they found some oil, but it was not enough. They sent someone to go and get oil, but it took him 8 days, and miraculously, this little oil that was not enough burned for 8 days. That is a later story. It was integrated into Hanukkah at a later date. The Hanukkahim, which is the menorah that we use at Hanukkah, has one more candle than the regular Hanukkah. Two really, because. And there's a candle for lighting it. The menorah is the symbol of the state of Israel, but the Hanukkah is the Hanukkah menorah, and it looks similar but not quite the same. It has 8 candles and then one extra for lighting for every night of Hanukkah. It's based on the Sukkot of 8 days. And it's a wonderful holiday. I will say, if anybody we will put recipes for
Oh,
latke
wonderful.
on
We
our
would love
blog,
that.
And
We would
I
love
will
that.
put the very important directions for how to play dreidel and how to gamble Jewish style
Okay.
with golden money. It's only a kid's game. Don't worry. It's
All right,
not a,
all right.
It's not big
We're not
money.
talking big
It's
money
not
here.
big money
No.
gamble.
Candy
It's
instead of
only
money.
raisins, only chocolates. The favorite are chocolate covered gold coins.
So you
Oh,
can
yeah,
Hanukkah. It's called
definitely.
Hanukkah Geld, and Geld means money in Yiddish.
love
Oh, I love it. I love it.
That is
well,
very
and
fun.
Christine, we're so excited to hear some of these amazing Maccabee stories because they are pretty exciting.
I'm not covering that much of the Maccabees because when the Maccabees finished and the first Hanukkah happened, then for another 100 years, the Maccabees continued to rule.
Right.
So Judas the Hammer was the kind of head, and his brother was John and became the high priest after Judas. And John did something that I don't think had ever been done before. And John took the Assyrians in Galilee and forced them to convert because they were fighting the Greeks as well. And the Greeks were still bugging them a lot. So he thought, oh, let's take all these people. And my question was, have you heard of that happening before where the Jews forced people to convert and join them?
Very, very not normal.
It was.
In Hungarian, there's a phrase that goes "nem normális," and that's how you say it all the time. Nem normális.
Yeah, that
and
was-
I'd say
that
that
is
is
not
a nem
normal.
normális thing to have happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because Jews were decidedly did not seek to convert. Now, interestingly, Achior, the guy who told that story to them, the one who was thrown at the foot,
Sure.
he converted.
But-
At the end of
Well,
that
but
story, he was circumcised.
we do have examples of especially women
Right.
who converted and who came back.
Ruth
I mean, we have
and Rahab, we've talked about both of
exactly.
them.
We love both of them, and so it's interesting to see that has been true
But
throughout
remember
the Old
that
Testament.
town that he wanted to marry Dinah, and
Oh,
the whole
yeah.
town got circumcised, and they
I felt so
left
sorry
them
for
alone.
them.
What happened?
They all got killed. They all got killed.
It's
So
a little
they wanted
harder for a
to.
guy
They wanted to.
convert Judaism than a girl to
A little more
It's a lot more painful. A lot more painful.
Yeah, I know.
Circumcision.
It's like that story about the pig and the chicken, and they like breakfast, and they want to have, they'd say, well, we can have ham and eggs, and the chicken says. And,
There's a little bit of a
the
difference.
pig says, I don't want to do it. And the chicken says, why not? It's just eggs. For you, it's just a contribution. For me, it's
my life.
It's me. It's me.
Well, anyway, so they did convert, and so his son, which was 2 leaders after Janus, then did something similar, but his was totally a different reason. He didn't want to fight against a common enemy. He wanted to fight against his own people. So Janus, it all came back to he was at the Feast of Tabernacles, and he was a new king, and he was a little bit of a drinker. And it says that that's what he died of, was drinking too much. So he was probably like this other man, a little sloshed. And he was to do the libation ceremony. And so, Marianna, that's your thing. Do you want to tell them a little bit about the libation ceremony? You may already know.
We'll be talking about the libation ceremony when we talk about the New Testament because it still was done during the time of the Savior as well. But at the pool of Siloam, I'm probably not saying it right. I know you're fluent in Hebrew and I'm not. But it's interesting to think about that wonderful ceremony where they would take the water and put it into a basin. And it was a very sacred time. But as you're going to tell us, because he was sloshed, he didn't get the water. He missed. He didn't get it in, and
the
people were
Pharisees
upset.
Were so angry he missed that they began to rebel. And so his plan was to go down to the people of Esau, the people of Idumea. And these were the men that ran many of the caravans. And they had a lot of mercenaries that would fight against them. And so they were good fighters. And so he had them convert. And because they were of the people of Esau, their religion was very close to the Hebrew religion. They had one God, but they did have an idol of him, but it was very similar. And so it was just a little tiny baby step to convert, and they were happy to. And they came and they fought against his own people, the people of Esau. And during that period of time, he killed over 50,000 of his own people. So they didn't ever rebel
Can you
again.
imagine?
He was not a good guy.
50,000. Well, no. Who would want to rebel again?
I
after that
know,
many
out of
people being
terror.
killed?
And this was the grandson of the Maccabees that had started this whole thing. So anyway, as he died early because of too much drink, is what it says. Josephus tells us. So what happened was, at that point, he turned to his wife. Now, he did have 2 sons, but he said to his wife, I want you to be the queen, and I want you to make peace with the Pharisees. And so instead of letting his sons rule, Queen Alexandra ruled for 9 years. And in the Talmud, if I can find it, I should be using my phone because it'd be easier to find it.
Oh.
But in the Talmud, they said what, I'm not going to even find it, doesn't matter. But they said what a moment of peace and joy it was during that reign, that she just created.
And I love that it's
Yeah,
a
it
woman
was
that brought
Queen
peace
Alexandra.
and joy to the people.
But she was a
Well, kind
little
of.
like Queen Elizabeth, where she waited too long, and her sons
that's
were
okay.
chomping at the bit.
You know, sometimes
They wanted to
like
take it
maybe
over.
It was inspired, to, in
Okay,
some
that's
ways,
fair.
it's true because, like, I mean, with Elizabeth, you did feel like there was a lot of ambiguity.
Oh, that is
or,
true.
Ambivalence.
I shouldn't-
Ambivalence is the word I'm looking for about what would come next.
Right.
Interesting,
And that's
because
true.
Yes.
What would come next is the big
That's
question
interesting, because
of
her
the
2
people.
sons, her oldest Hyrcanus, was a man of peace and kindness, but her younger son, Aristobulus, how do you say that? Because you
Aristobulus.
Okay, that's
Sounds
how I
good
say
to me.
Aristobulus.
Aristobulus.
He
I have to
was
look at them.
he was kind of
And I said with
a
Hungarian
naughty
accent.
boy. He was a fighter, and he came from a family of fighters, so he was a big fighter. So anyway, when she passed, Aristobulus was ready, and so he grabbed his people. And in the first battle between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, these 2 brothers that are battling, Hyrcanus was just wiped out, and his people actually went to the other side. They're like, this guy's a better general, you stink. And so they all left him. But that group of people down near Hebron, the tribe of Esau, the Edomians, they're like, Hyrcanus was the kind, good, peaceful brother, and they came up, and Antipater was the governor, brought all these troops and supported Hyrcanus. And so Hyrcanus is outside of Jerusalem with these new troops, and inside is Aristobulus thinking he's all cool, and they're at a standstill. And as they're at a standstill, suddenly General Pompey comes, the Roman general, comes and says, you know what? You guys are having a war. I'm ending it. And they're done. And without a single bit of bloodshed, it's over.
It's over.
So interesting.
And
So he
the
just
power of
steps
Rome.
in.
The power
But if
of
they
Rome.
had just said, okay, you be the high priest, I'll be the king, everything's good, who knows how long they would have continued. But it was that fight
Right.
that left the opening for Rome to come and take control.
Christine, I love that you shared this story because I think, as I've mentioned other places, we can learn so much from bad examples. We can bounce off
true.
of bad examples.
It's true.
And no, we can. And this, unfortunately, this is an ongoing problem of siblings.
interesting.
Instead of
Fighting each other.
appreciating
You're right.
what they've been given, instead of appreciating how blessed they are for their shared heritage and that they can share that history, and they have to somehow, one has to be over the other, one has
Right.
to have it all, one has to, and what a bad example that is.
That is
and
fascinating.
how important it is for us to think deeply about that in our own sibling
Right.
situations.
And to bring families together rather than split them apart.
And to understand it involves forgiveness, it involves humility, it involves, it would involve all the things that they didn't practice, because you're right, there was enough for them to share and to have a peaceable follow up.
You're making me think of my friend who hates to go to the parade of homes. Like before Christmas, everyone goes,
yeah. Oh,
because
definitely.
all it does is make her come home and hate her own life. And
I
it's
love
that attitude that creates that kind of
that comparison.
yes, and
you
it's
have
what
more
we
than
do
me.
as women all
we
the
do.
time.
Just to be aware of it
I
and to
know.
watch it and to understand
And to
that's what we want to
soften it.
bounce off of.
Oh,
we don't want to be that.
It
you
is
know?
true.
So
It is true.
how did
Anyway.
the Herods get involved then?
Well, this is so funny. So Pompey is in Damascus. He says, come and you can each make your argument to become king. And he's going to decide which of the two brothers are king. And beside Hyrcanus is Antipater, this governor of Idumea. And he comes up with Hyrcanus by his side. And Pompey listens to the two brothers and says, neither one of you are going to be king. He is.
I
And
love it.
Antipater becomes the leader. He's not a king. He's just called a leader or a minister of Israel. But he has an 8-year-old son. And his 8-year-old son is Herod.
Right.
And so that's how Herod came in from this other group of people that Janus had forced to convert, but actually were very covenant people.
Right. Well, he
So-
also marries in to the
He does
the Maccabees
later, but
later.
he never expected to be king.
Right,
And that's
he
when a thing is 20 years later, Pompey's been assassinated.
Right.
And Herod now is old enough. And when Julius Caesar moves in, he says, okay, Antipater, you're still leader. Your one son, your oldest son, Faisal, will become the governor of Jerusalem, while Herod will become the governor of Galilee. So Herod's excited. He marries a common woman. He's so happy, has his first little boy, builds a huge palace, and is just living happily ever after his best life. But when Julius Caesar is assassinated, then, of course, you know what happens is both his father is poisoned, Herod's father is poisoned, and Herod's brother ends up being captured and kills himself rather than being tortured. And so with the death of his family, Herod runs to two people you may recognize, Mark Antony and Cleopatra down in Egypt.
Right.
He sets his family up safe in Masada, in the fort, and then he runs down there. And Antony is actually in Rome. So he says, okay, I'm going to go to Rome and see if I can get some retribution for my family. And he gets in, but it's winter time, and there's a huge storm as he's on the Mediterranean, and he gets shipwrecked at Rhodes. So here he is at Rhodes. He's in essence penniless. He's not sitting on the throne. His family has been devastated. And he sees that their main city has been totally wiped out by war. And so he thinks, you know what? I am an artist. And I relate to this because I consider myself not an artist like you. She
Well,
does beautiful pictures,
I love
but
to
just
paint.
kind of an artistic. I love art. So he decides to design the city of Rhodes and how it should be, and actually architecturally design how the whole city should be. And then he goes to the fathers of the city and he sells them his plans, and they give him enough money. It's got to be gorgeous what he did.
Oh, Herod was a builder, though.
And he
we know
was.
that.
He was a
just
designer
loved
and a
it.
builder.
He
And
was
that's
an
what he
architect.
loved. And so
amazing.
they were so impressed that they gave him enough money to build a fine ship, to deck himself out, kind of like Judas. So, all beautiful. And then he heads out on that ship and approaches the Roman Senate looking like a king. And they declare him king of the Jews when an enemy is sitting on the throne and his
Right.
family is tucked away in Masada. Is that the oddest story you've ever heard?
It's a great story. I mean, it is. It's interesting. Presentation can be important, right?
Oh, definitely. Dressing up.
Story? I
Dressing
don't know.
up.
But as Herod, let me go back to my notes, and I'm sorry. As Herod came back, he did not have the troop strength to take on Jerusalem. So he went back to his Galilee, and there was a sudden snowstorm. And that snowstorm was what allowed him to take over Galilee, because the other people couldn't fight in it
They would
as
not
well.
use a snowstorm.
Right. It
That
wasn't.
is
It was
Washington,
It
DC
was
in a
a free.
snowstorm.
It was exactly like a Washington,
They're
Washington
all messed
State. When they're up there and they don't.
But
know how
also
to deal.
realize the fact that he had that relationship with Mark Antony and Cleopatra also did help him to other people acknowledged that and knew
Right.
that, and it also gave him the support
Absolutely.
in terms of what was
It's not
Rome
what you
was
know, it's
before.
who you know.
Exactly. Even at that
Exactly.
time, that was even probably more
Right.
important than now.
Well, the people were amazed because he seemed to have the Lord on his side.
Right.
Not out of righteousness, but they called it good fortune. Because shortly after he took Galilee, then he was taking a bath and 3 assassins came in to kill him. And they said either that they didn't see him or they were afraid of his naked body, which is
Oh no! I wonder what that looked like.
Good with his clothes off, I guess. He looked better all decked out.
Like, oh no! Naked
But it was
body.
Probably like many
yes,
of us.
but it was amazing. And then Mark Antony arrived with his troops, and they took Jerusalem, and so he became the king. And that was a horrible, yucky battle. But he said, don't kill as many people. Stop it. You're going to make me the king of a desert.
Right.
And so he did become king. But right after that, he took all of the people, the leaders of each family, and he went and had them to a great feast. And the roof collapsed of that building, and he walked out unscathed, was one of the few people that weren't harmed. And so people really did feel like he was being protected by God. There was a feeling that he was there, which is so different than the end of his life.
Right.
So immediately he looks at his kingdom, and it had just been fallen to pieces. This whole war with the whole Maccabees for 100 years, they hadn't been able to build. It had just been destruction, destruction, destruction. Right. So he went throughout the entire state and started building. And he started in Samaria, which is really odd. And then he just continues through and builds and builds and builds. And he built palaces. He built aqueducts. He built sewer systems that were new for the day. And, he built so many huge things. And of course, 20 years before the birth of Christ, he started on the
does
temple.
The temple. Right. And it's so beautiful. That temple
Oh.
is ready for the Savior. When he
Exactly. And I love that he did the women's porch and the Gentiles' porch. So there was a place like here for you to just sit and talk about spiritual and beautiful things and to feel that interaction. So he did all of those great things. That's not to say everything he did was great.
Oh, definitely. And we have those negative stories at the beginning of the New Testament about Herod.
Oh my gosh! Yes, I mean we think of
very
Herod
negative.
as a bad person. It's so wonderful to hear these stories because, of course, there are so many times when we only know this piece about somebody and we don't know the whole story.
Exactly.
And we don't know, and people are a mixed bag. When we are honest,
Love it.
we are
People
a mixed
are
bag.
a mixed
Each
bag.
one
We
of
have
us
the
is
good, the
a
bad, and the
beautiful,
ugly.
I love this. This one little quote from the Apocrypha before we leave it behind forever,
Don't wanna-
Which makes
because
me
it's
so
so
happy.
beautiful. I think
We
it's
wanna
just so
remember.
apropos to Herod. It says, "Let no sinner say that he has not sinned, for God will burn coals of fire on the head of him who says, I have not sinned before God in his glory. Behold, the Lord knows all the works of men, their imaginations and their thoughts and their hearts." And then it goes on, it says, he said, let the earth be made, and it was made. It goes on with all of the incredible miracles that he wrought. And it says, surely he knows your imaginations and what you think in your hearts. Woe to those who sin and want to hide their sins, because the Lord will strictly examine all their works and will make a public spectacle of you, of all of you. And when your sins come out before men, you shall be put to shame, and your own iniquities shall stand as your accusers in that day. I love it.
I
that we
love that.
all,
We all
we
have the
all
good and the bad.
That's right.
But we're
And
trying to make the good better.
we are, and how important for us, though, to be looking at ourselves, to be looking, and when we hear about Herod and all the incredible, the interesting story, and the incredible things he did, and then the terrible fact that when the moment was there,
We're going to hear some of those.
That's the
terrible
next
stories.
terrible things that come. So
anyway, but that's
right.
a wonderful backstory that should humble us all.
Right.
You
I
know?
love that. But when he became king, he decided that he would marry Marianna, the granddaughter of both of the sons. So there was a little bit of inbreeding there. But he married Marianna, which made him one of the Maccabees, which gave him
brought that together.
But it was sad
Right.
because he took his first wife and his little boy and had them banished so that the Jews would accept him. But still, they didn't like him very much ever
Yeah.
because he
No, he
wasn't
was not
a
loved.
natural born Jew. He was of the tribe of Ezra. I mean, of Ezra. No, look at me. He was of the tribe of
Esau.
That's it. Esau.
He was
The
Esau,
other
which
brother,
is not
Jacob
really
and Esau.
tribe, but
Esau,
he was
that group
that
of
part.
Esau,
Yes.
the
Yes.
descendants of Esau,
Yes,
who,
the
also
Edomians.
were the ones who told Holofernes to block off the water.
Oh, was
They
that?
were,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
Oh, wow.
Isn't
It
that
was the same
interesting?
people,
Yeah.
which is part of the reason they didn't like them, because they also egged on the Babylonians.
Right.
So it was kind of a long-term feud that they
Oh,
didn't like them.
thousands
And
of
he was the head.
So
of feud.
we're going to kind of bring things together. What I'm hoping to do here at the end is to kind of put all these stories into a larger context. So when we talk about Daniel, which we have during the Old Testament, it's interesting that Nebuchadnezzar, our favorite bad guy.
Actually, we talked about it.
I know.
Babylonian / Syrian,
Basically, Nebuchadnezzar did have this amazing vision of an image that has gold and brass and all these other metals and then clay at the bottom. Christine, I know that you know a lot about this image and especially the civilizations that each part of that image represents. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind kind of talking about that for a minute.
Well, in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the first thing he saw was a head of gold. And the head of gold was his own Babylonian empire that would take the people of God and pull them in. And then there were the arms and the breast of silver. And we all know about, I shouldn't say we all know, because not everybody knows, none of my family knows, about King Cyrus's dream.
Right.
And how he woke up and he heard the Lord say that you will have all the kingdoms of the earth if you build me a temple with the Jews.
Yes.
And so he frees them. And that's where I love the arms and the heart are Cyrus and the Persian Empire carrying them back home.
Right.
And doing the temple, the heart of the Lord. So isn't that fun? That's that. And then you have the waist, and the waist is of brass. And I laughed because I was saying the Greeks are like,
about that.
with free sex, woohoo!
Yeah, I know. So they're
It's
that
the whole
part.
Greek wild part. And then the legs are the Romans. And the Romans we know of iron that created the roads and their great marches.
Exactly.
And it's so odd how each piece is so symbolic of what that
civilizations.
civilization
so interesting.
did.
I'd never thought of it
And
like
then
this.
they kind of fall apart, which is the clay.
The clay at the end.
And so that is this great image, which is a reflection of how the people of God would be couched during, in essence,
This
the entire
400
period.
years that we're talking about.
Well, and even more than that, during the entire time of biblical times.
Well, and as we're going to be talking about at the very end of this, we also have this
Even
beautiful
today.
vision of the stone carved out of, that comes and breaks the clay.
mountain, yeah.
Right there.
That comes out of the mountain.
So
Without
what I
hands.
wanted to talk a little bit, just holistically, is the Greek Empire, what that has to do with the New Testament times, and also the Romans, because both of them do, on a holistic way, have huge, power in terms of what's going to be happening when we talk about the New Testament. So the Greek Empire, of course, the Greeks were just city-states until about 336, when Alexander the Great takes over Macedonia. He becomes king, and wow, what a general. He truly is incredible. All along the Mediterranean, if you look at the Mediterranean, sometimes we think, okay, Spain is over here, Africa is over here, so we kind of go Spain and Africa, but realize they are so close together. And Egypt is so close to, if you look, when we talk about Rome and Egypt, that was just a short little trip across the Mediterranean. And Greece is actually right in front of the Nile. And so when the Nile comes, especially during the time of the year when the Nile floods and it goes into the Mediterranean, what it does is it actually does a current that just kind of makes those boats go straight into Greece. And so that whole waterway that we're talking about, Alexander the Great just went from place to place to place all along the Mediterranean and just took over that entire area. The other thing that Alexander the Great did is every single time he took over an area of the world, he would also establish a city and a school. And the school would teach Greek and would teach them about their gods and teach them about their philosophy and their ideas, the Greek philosophy. So this was the Hellenization of this whole world. So when we talk about the Hellenization, it's just making everybody Greek. It's kind of what it is. And so realize the positive about this is all along the Mediterranean coast, Greek becomes the common language.
Which is a big thing.
And so everybody speaks Greek because Alexander taught everybody through these schools how to teach Greek. So by the time we get to the New Testament, realize the New Testament was written in Greek.
Yes.
And when Paul goes around as a missionary, he is speaking in Greek. And that's what he's doing all the way from Spain to Egypt and all along the Mediterranean. The common language was Greek, and it's because of Alexander the Great.
Sort of like, English has become the
Exactly.
most common language now. Much more than when I was young. I traveled a lot because my father's job involved, and people didn't speak English. You had to speak French in France, and German in Germany, and Hungarian in Hungary. Now you go around the
English is
so many people speak English. Not
the
everybody
language of
speaks
Exactly.
commerce.
English.
Yes.
But
And so that's exactly what happens here is Greek becomes the language of commerce. Now, after Alexander the Great had done all of this around the Mediterranean, he dies at a very young age. He's only 33 years old, and there's some questions as to, whether it was nefarious, whether he was poisoned or whatever happened. But he had 4 very strong generals, and some of them are names that we've already talked about. So he had the Ptolemy, Antigonus, Cassander, and Seleucus, who we love that name. Like I said, we looked it up last night because do you want to say what you used to think?
say Seleucid because I just read it and I was so wrong. It's Seleucid.
sounds good.
And so that's one of the problems with readers is oftentimes we read words and we're not sure exactly how to say it. So, but it is Seleucus. And so basically Ptolemy and Seleucus had this fight that you were talking about that is talked a lot about in the Apocrypha in terms of Ptolemy first took over the Israel area, the Palestine, and when he was there, he kind of let people continue doing their own Jewish thing. He allowed them to worship the way they wanted to. But when we have the Seleucid Empire taking over, we have the story that you were telling in that
It's the fourth.
he just stops things in terms
So
of saying,
helpful.
we want you to be Greek. We want you to have multiple gods. We don't want you just to have one. We want you to understand the whole pantheon. And so that kind of gives you kind of a feel, and we already talked about the Maccabees, but that kind of puts it into how the Seleucid and how all these empires kind of go together. Well, you kind of already talked about the Romans coming in and taking over. But the main thing about the Romans that we have to remember is that the Romans really were the ones that enabled Paul and all the other apostles to go throughout the world because of the roads. They put in this wonderful road system. The other thing, too, is that the Romans truly believed in this Pax Romana, which means peace. So they said, look, we're going to conquer you, but you can do your own thing as much as you want, as long as you are peaceful and don't wreck up the Roman Empire.
But if you're not peaceful,
Well,
genocide.
exactly.
Like, everyone's
you're
gone.
done.
You're out.
There's
You're
no
done.
line.
Completely.
And
Exactly.
I think that's where you saw Herod take such extreme measures of killing his own children, of killing
Because
his wife.
he wanted peace.
Because he was worried
He
the
knew.
Romans would come in and
He
destroy
knew.
them.
Exactly.
So that piece is so funny and
And
oxymoron.
It doesn't afford spiritual growth to get
No. This
I would
is
say, the thought of it is like, killing off the kids who aren't being good.
I know.
but that's definitely what the
not a good
Romans
plan.
did.
You've got to give everybody a chance to grow.
Yeah, but
And
that was
including
not
us.
the
This
Roman
is
way.
something for us to think about as we go in to read the New Testament, because some of the things that we're going to be talking about is
Yes.
that tension between the importance of having a peaceful state, which the Romans were very strong about. That's the reason why these governors would come, and they would come with lots and lots of soldiers. So, they would do these amazing parades of all the soldiers, and it was basically a sign of power. And they were saying, look, we're allowing you to have a Herod. We're allowing you to have a council. You Jews can do your own thing as long as you are peaceful and you don't, go
And
out
you
of
pay
line.
your taxes.
And you pay your taxes.
Pay your taxes.
And that's the other
It was
thing.
all about the money.
It was all about the money. And we talked about that before. But one thing that they would also do is, of course, at the very beginning of the New Testament, Caesar Augustus tells all the people to go back to their nativity, the place where their family was born, and to have a census. And that was for taxation. He wanted to find out exactly how many people he had to tax, so he knew how much tax to make sure all of them had. And so that was the purpose. That's the beginning of the New Testament and also realize that's the reason why the publicans were so hated, because they were a symbol of the fact that, Rome is really in charge. They are actually taking our money. They are actually the ones that are in charge.
But it's always left me a little like head scratching. Like, don't they remember about Nebuchadnezzar's dream? They were told they were going to be underneath someone else's rule. So why are they fighting so hard for this freedom when until the time of the end of the world, when the stone's going to come without hands, they're going to be under someone's thumb?
But realize
It's a
too,
human desire.
that it's a human desire. I
It's a
agree.
deep human
We
desire.
want to
Maybe
be
they
free.
just didn't remember.
We want to be free. Well, but I
not
don't
all
blame
over.
them.
Yeah.
I don't blame them.
I
A
mean,
matter of
one
fact,
does
we
know-
would feel the same way.
Yes, and even though you're right, probably these stories were known. They were repeated. I mean, they did not have the mechanisms we do. There was no printing press.
no,
There was
Right.
no,
And there was no Google to
To find it out.
People were living, and all they knew was that these publicans in the Rome,
Right,
they took their
right.
taxes, and that they weren't free to be me. I mean, they
No,
had
they still had to
could
do
their
their
thing,
thing.
but it had to be under the authority and umbrella.
So
of this
another thing
outsider.
to realize too, that the governor was the only one that could actually say somebody could be put to death. So the council could do all other things. They could put them into jail. They could
It was until Archelaus, Herod's son, that rule was made, because Archelaus made some really bad choices and put a lot more people to death.
Right.
than
Who was
there
going to be killed.
sedition. And so that's when they made the choice.
So the reason why I'm bringing this up is to realize that the Roman government, but also the Greek civilization, have a huge power in the New Testament. Right. And we're going to see that, and we're going to think about that in terms of how, the Romans and the Greeks have to do with the world of the Savior. The other thing that I think is really powerful, specifically about the Romans, is the Romans really they were positive about women. And so we're going to see some of that influence, especially in the Jewish communities, as we talk about the New Testament, is that the Romans were a little nicer to women than some of the other civilizations previously. And I think that is really positive. We're going to see that women do have power in Rome in terms of the Senate and some of the things that they were involved in. And I do think that also influences the way women were perceived in the New Testament times, even in Palestine. So as we end and we talk about Daniel, we discussed kind of the overview of the Apocrypha, the beautiful sacred writings that we discussed, but then we also talked about this historical Maccabees, the Herod time, but also the Greeks and Romans. I wanted to end with Daniel's vision, coming to the end, the latter-day part, where he says, "Forasmuch as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter, and the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure." In the latter days, Joseph Smith also refers back to this, and he says, "The keys of the kingdom of God are committed unto man on the earth, and from thence shall the gospel roll forth unto the ends of the earth, as the stone which is cut out of the mountain without hands shall roll forth until it has filled the whole earth. For me, this is the ending of what we're talking about today. We've talked about this intertestamentary time between the Old and New Testament, but the power of what we're talking about, the power of Daniel's vision, is that of the latter days. And this wonderful experience that we're going through right now with the gospel rolling forth throughout all the world. So I wanted each one of us to maybe talk here at the end about our thoughts and feelings about the gospel of Jesus Christ going out to the world.
I told you this story before. When I was on my mission, we were knocking on doors. And there was a man that answered the door and said, if you can tell me the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, then I will join your church. And I was like, oh, I've heard of it, and so I ran home with my companion and we pulled it open and I'm like, what? So all of these kingdoms and the stone cut without hands is the modern day gospel, because it comes from a different place. It's restored. It doesn't come from these people, the Jews who we revere, but it comes from a restoration, from a different place, and fills the whole earth. And we're the missionaries that are filling the whole earth. And I go back thrilled to tell him this story. And he's like, you blew it. You missed it. So from then on, I'm like, I'm never going to blow it again. If anyone asks me this question, we
I know.
are that
I know
stone.
what that is.
We're all part of that stone as it rolls and changes and fills the earth. And it's so exciting to see in the Old Testament, and even through this time, that the Lord had a plan for the gospel to come back and be restored in its fullness, and that it would be available to everyone. And we see temples dot the entire planet. It's so shocking, because you think when we were so young, and there was 25. I remember talking about the 25, but they were really mostly.
Oh, see, I'm older than you, and I can remember the 12. I mean, there was only a dozen temples, and so it's true.
And the difference, and now it really does fill the whole earth.
I
agree. And what a
agree.
fulfillment of prophecy all the way back from Daniel is just. I love the restored gospel of Christ.
Annette, I know you have such a strong testimony.
I love the way that all of our stories, Judith, which was one woman who was doing the same things, by the way, that we're doing now, praying, fasting, holding true to her covenant. And through that had the power to overcome mighty superior military force. I mean, it's a story, it's true, it's not true, but it doesn't matter. That was what was laid out. And that is what we understand to be true about the gospel. True. These truths are mightier than any other power on the face of the earth.
I agree.
They are mighty to transform our lives. They're mighty to transform the world. They're mighty to transform all of the problems we face, as our prophets would tell us. I know, in my own little tiny story, that I'll tell you very quickly, and it sort of, I think, ties in, that, of course, I was brought up by parents. Both of my parents were survivors of the Holocaust.
Right.
My father, they had very different responses when they came to America. My father he wanted to put religion out of their lives. He had seen it cause so much horror and despair. He had seen supposedly religious people behaving in terrible ways. My mother who was a little younger, wondered, why was she preserved? Why were so many people killed? Why was she still alive? And she felt that she needed a bigger answer than society offered. She said all she could remember was Woody Woodpecker was very popular. Oh. And everybody, it was always about whether you were going to buy the newest washing machine or the newest this device or that device. And she had come from actually a very well-to-do background. They'd lost everything. And she thought, it cannot be about
Things.
Refurbishing our nest, That cannot be why I was spared this horrific inferno that swept over most of her family and most of the people that she knew. So she began this great search, which my father was not involved in that at all. And eventually and amazingly, it led her to the gospel of Jesus Christ. But my father, who was open-minded with certain hedges, he wanted us all to grow up to be open-minded just like he was.
Right.
That was his goal. He told my mother, he was not happy. And actually, when they gave him an opportunity to say no, because the leaders of the ward, before she was baptized, wanted to get her husband's permission. My father,
Sure.
my wonderful liberal-minded husband, said no. Absolutely not. And it wasn't until Bruce McConkie was the president of the mission in Australia, told my mother, I am an even greater authority than your husband, and I'm going to say yes, that she was baptized. Isn't that interesting? So she had to defy that authority. But my father said, don't you dare try to teach this to our I have one sister, to my two beautiful little girls. I'm not going to have them roped in. And we got to go to the Unitarian Church. He'd let us do that, which I did enjoy. There were lots of wonderful lessons we learned there. But as I got older, and in particular when I was about 17, 18 years old, we were in Israel in the summer for some work that my dad was doing. And on a kibbutz one night, I had an enormously strong spiritual experience. I didn't even know what a spiritual experience was, so I was embarrassed. I didn't want to tell anybody. But it was huge, and I wrote it down. I felt like I was aroused. We were on a kibbutz. I was aroused from bed, and I was told, these are your people. This is your land. I didn't know that because we were not taught that in any clear way that I understood. And I was moved. I was confused. I decided instead of going to college, I was going to stay in Israel. And my father, for some reason, had to go back to the States. He came back with news, because we'd left in April, that I had been accepted at Yale University, which I was like, it was completely odd to me. I had applied like you. I'm trying to think what's a good metaphor for it, but like you put on some funny costume or something because you think it's fun. I just thought it was fun that girls could do that. They could apply. It was the first year or the second year, I think, that girls could apply
to Yale.
I
know. So understand, it used to be just a male institution, and you were one of the first women there.
And I knew about it.
And you were studying the Old Testament too.
Right, that was later when I went
with
to...
the Jewish history.
Yeah, when I went to graduate school there. But at that point, I just knew a guy who was there, and he told it, and I thought, this is so cool. I'm just going to apply, It did not occur to me. And my father said, you have to do this. And I had really wanted to come back to Israel. But instead, I found myself in New Haven in the fall.
And I love who was there. I mean, you need to make sure who was in New
Haven
Haven at the same time.
I didn't know my first year. I'll tell you when I found that out.
But you need to say the name.
Well,
so
Elder Holland was there.
Elder Holland was
Jeff
there.
Holland and his beautiful wife, Pat, and their three darling children, Duffy and Mary and Michael, were all there living in student housing.
Right.
Because Elder Holland was finishing his PhD in American Studies at Yale. Well, I didn't know that, and I was there. I didn't know anything about any of that. But I did know, as I became more active, in school and everything, that I was sort of at the pinnacle of intellectual, it was the rarefied place. And I felt very quickly, this is not enough. There has to be more than this. These great professors, they're wonderful, but there has to be more. And I began thinking about it a lot. And one day, and I'll never forget, in those days, girls lived in a special place, especially the freshman girls, lived in Vanderbilt Hall on the old campus, and there was a guard, and you couldn't come up unless you got through the guard.
Oh, I love it.
And very few people could get through the guard. But one day, somebody knocked on we had a door, a sort of a suite. We had a common room and 2 bedrooms. And somebody knocked on the door, and it was one of the very handsome freshman boys. His name was George Hopfer. If you're listening, George, I remember. Anyway, I don't. And I was a little stunned. He said, "Yeah, I came to see you. I talked to the guard. He let me come up." I'm like, "Oh, great." And then he was just telling me about what he was doing. We were all quite fresh on campus, freshmen, and he said he was going to be in the Yale Glee Club, and the Yale Glee Club was going to sing Jesus Christ Superstar. They were going to perform the music
I love it.
from Jesus Christ Superstar. And I'm thinking, wow, that sounds great. He said, and George came from an Episcopalian background. He said, it was written by somebody who doesn't portray Jesus as the Son of God, just as a really wise rabbi and teacher. I realized that George, in all his magnificent handsomeness, completely began to fade and all I could think about was what he said.
Was Jesus Christ.
And it was like, I don't even know what happened to him. I may have just shut the door on him. I am not kidding you. I think because I know he never came in, I think I shut the door. I said, thank you. That's so interesting. And I went into my room and I thought, this is a huge question you need to confront. Who was Jesus?
Wow. I love that.
That it was very powerful to me. And it was funny when I thought about that I didn't think about anything else. That was all I could think about then. And I thought, how do you answer that question? My sweet mother had read us the Bible stories when we were young. So we did have that background, but did not go to church, nothing like that. But she had given me a small Gideon's New Testament, a little green Gideon's New Testament. She said,
love it.
Annette, if you have really serious problems, you need to read this book. And so I felt like this was the big problem I had. It was a big issue. And I got it, I opened to the Sermon on the Mount. And I started reading those beautiful lessons in chapter 5 of Matthew and going on and on. And I thought, this is such a humble person. How could he say that he was the way, the truth, and the light? Because I remember, that was... And I felt, how can I find out? And I thought the only thing I can do is ask God. I mean, I can't, I have all these things that we're reading and studying and learning, but this is not something you can study it in a book and get the right answer.
I love it. It's the living word.
And it was all just, what I felt. And I did get a huge, strong, overwhelming feeling that Jesus was the Christ. Very similar to the feeling, different from, but similar to this kind of overwhelming experience I'd had in Israel, that I was a Jew. That I was, this was my people and this was from whence I'd come. Now I knew that Jesus was the Messiah. He was not just a teacher. And then I started going to lots of different churches at Yale. I did all kinds of things, searching and searching. When I came home, one of my dear friends, who was a girlfriend, when I say dear friends, we were in different schools, but I think it's a great example of missionary work.
Right.
This darling girl who my mother would go to, but we never, called me for years, inviting me to things. I never went. My father would have been infuriated. I was like, it's so sweet, Kristen. She was very sweet, very beautiful, very charming and cute. And I was quite flattered that she would invite me, to anything, and that I'd be invited. I didn't go to parties, And she called as soon as I came home from church. I mean, she did not lose faith. Kristen did not give up on me.
She kept on asking
year
you.
after
I like
year after year. And I always said no.
I know.
Always said no. She calls me and says, hey, Annette, would you like to come to church with me? Again,
Wow.
And I am feeling my wild oats, and I say, yes, I'm going to do that.
Wow.
Not that I would ever, in my mind, it didn't even occur to me that I would consider becoming a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because my father, who was, as I said, very open-minded, was also a powerful figure.
Yes.
As for all his liberality, he was a completely traditional Jewish patriarch in our home. Everything flowed from him. My mother was fantastic. She was every bit as smart, but my dad was the head of our home. But I felt like I was now a college student. I could go to any church I wanted to, So I went to church with Kristen. I saw the missionaries, and I thought, wow, they have a great setup here. The other churches, it's really hard. It's hard to figure out what they actually believe. But, they have this system. Yeah, sure, I'll listen to them. It's part of my going
Looking
over
at
everything, studying everything. So I invited the missionaries. They were very sweet. They came to our home, and they began teaching me, and I was very combative. I had all sorts of reasons.
I love it.
And I talked about the Catholic Church and authority and Peter and the rock. And, I'd done my little Western civilization class and could say all those things. And it was interesting because sometimes they'd bring someone else with them. And once when I was talking to the Catholic Church, the fellow said, I used to be a Catholic and I know what you believe.
Oh, and that made a difference, I bet.
The biggest thing was, though, that my mother, who did the newsletter for her ward, often asked me, I did a lot of newspaper stuff. I was the editor of our high school paper, I was the editor on the Yale Daily News. She gave me a book. She said, honey, I just need your help. Just read this book and write a book report because I need it. I need a report for the thing. The book was by a Black member of the church, and it was called You and Me, Lord. And I remember going to our front lawn and reading this book and being completely overcome by the humility of this man. that his only real concern was finding truth. I realized, yes, I wanted to find truth, but I wanted the truth that was, fit into all the little compartments of my life that my dad would think was okay, that was intellectually acceptable for me, that was not, going to. And his purity of heart completely overwhelmed me. I realized I was here and he was here. Wow. And when we got to the part where you prayed, we're in Moroni, is it 10:15?
Right.
That if you pray with a sincere heart, with a true desire to know the truthfulness, I realized, okay, got to work on the sincere heart piece. And I did. And I prayed. And I had the same experience I'd had when I'd known I was Jewish, when I'd known Jesus was the Messiah. I knew that this book was truly a record prepared by the Lord to help us in these latter days.
I love it.
And there was no looking back. I got on that path, and it's been complete.
Annette, your testimony has always just strengthened mine. Oh. And I love your conversion story, because for me, especially as we think about the New Testament, that's one of the reasons why I'm so glad that you're with us.
Thank you,
is
Marianna.
Because I know we love each other. It's because I just love the fact that you have this beautiful Jewish background that is just so incredible. But the fact that you saw that Jesus is the Christ, and then the fact that you've lived such a Christ-like life since then, what a wonderful example you are to us in terms of that conversion that all of us have to go through. Matter of fact, that's the final part that I wanted to bring to pass, is this idea of, as we look forward to the New Testament, each one of us has to have the same experience you had, in terms of really having that testimony that Jesus is our rock, that he is our foundation. And when we were working with the missionaries, in Sao Paulo, we mission leaders there in Sao Paulo. And one of my favorite things to read to them in the Doctrine and Covenants is section 33. Because it says over and over again, open your mouths, open your mouths, open your mouths. And I love that story of that beautiful young woman who never gave up. She opened her mouth. But at the end of that, it also talks very specifically in section 33 that it talks about the doctrine of Christ, and then it says, verily, verily, I say unto you, this is my gospel, the gospel of the doctrine of Christ. And remember that you shall have faith in me, or they can in no wise be saved, and upon this rock will I build my church. Yea, upon this rock ye are built. And if you continue, the gates of hell shall not prevail against you. For me, that is the power of the stone cut without hands that comes and breaks everything else. It is the rock of our Savior, Jesus Christ. And as we think about him as our foundation, our rock, it truly will overflow throughout the entire world. And that's the reason why I'm so excited about the New Testament and our study together, because we will hopefully have our thoughts and feelings about the Savior increase, but also make him truly our foundation, our rock, as we look forward to this next year. So thank you. I love you both so much. We all need a hug fest. Hug fest. I know. I wish I was on the sofa with you. So, but thank you for sharing your beautiful thoughts today.
Well, I'm so excited. I'm excited to learn and love and have this great time together.
And we're so excited to share with others these experiences of our lives that have brought us to that place where we know that that is our sure foundation.
I agree.
And it can be the sure foundation for every single human being.
I love that. And I'm hoping people put in the comments things they like, they don't like, and things that they think of what we've said, because we will respond. I'm looking forward to that.
I'm not very good at that, but I will say this.
We'll teach you.
Yeah, one of my children sent me a thing from the comments of the other thing, and somebody said, her long hair is really annoying me. So I cut it. So we do respond.
Even cutting our hair.
No, now it's short compared to what it was.
I love it. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us. And we look forward to a year together being able to talk about the Savior.